So welcome to the SquashSkills podcast. I'm your host, Jethro Binns. Today we're going to be talking to one of the most successful coach-player relationships, possibly of all time, in the form of Nick Matthew and David Pearson. So firstly, welcome to the show. My first question is finding out how you're coping in these strange times that we're living in, and how you're coping with lockdown, how you're keeping your connection to squash. So DP, do you want to start us off?
Well, my lockdown is very simple. I get up at 9 o'clock every morning. I make up a cup of coffee. Then I look at the computer for half an hour. Then I take the dogs for an hour and a half walk, come back, make lunch, and then I'm bored on my mind for the rest of the day. That's sort of the general gist of my lockdown at the moment. Not that much.
Good normal day.
Yeah. I mean, and really I haven't had much contact with squash, really. You know, Nick will ring up every now and then and a couple of others, but not really much contact with squash at all. So that's sort of the gist of what I've been up to. Not much.
And what about you, Nick?
I have this annoying habit of calling DP always. I always call him. I try to keep in touch, but I always call him when I'm in the car, and obviously I'm not doing that anymore, so I keep forgetting to call him now. I speak to his daughter more than I speak to him. Both daughters, actually.
Yeah, you probably do.
But no, to be honest, it's been going kind of quickly. You have your moments where you kind of realise what's happening, but when you've got two kids, one of them's still 10 months, the other one's 5, so we're trying to do the homeschool, and then by the time you fit a bit of exercise in and meal times and
what's that?
Oh, you know it. Yeah, well, yeah. DP 1995 was the last time DP did a bit of exercise.
Hey, actually, you're not far wrong. That's about it. And then one day I saw myself at the pyramids, in front of the 3 pyramids, going back in the day, and I looked at myself and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe how fat I'd become. And that was the beginning of trying to get a little bit fitter, and that's been about the gist of my training regime over the last 15 years.
How long did that last?
Probably about a year. With Carter. He used to motivate me.
I remember you playing that exhibition match with Randolph at Harrogate about 10 years ago, and we kind of got you on, and Randolph's a player that DP coached basically from a complete beginner up to a decent club standard, and challenged him to a match to say, come on DP, I can beat you now, I can beat you, you know, you're too slow, you might have the skills, but you're beaten now. So they had the challenge match, and we did a little exhibition. We were the warm-up act for DP main event, me and Laura, I think. And you went on, didn't you? You had a great match. You were about the same standard because it was his fitness against your skill. And at the end, he made this rousing speech to the crowd, like, this has inspired me. I'm going to be on court now every week. I'm going to train. You didn't go back on once.
Well, you know, we've got other things to do. So the other thing I'm on at the moment is that our house is being hammered with walls coming down and everything. So at the moment, we're living in a sort of a bit of a pigsty in the middle of this building site.
That doesn't sound like Joe.
Well, Joe loves all of that. That's my wife, by the way. So she loves all of that. Yeah, so that's been the lockdown for us. So, yeah.
So your friendship is still as strong as ever then, so post-play. Because when did you stop working together as a,
Probably, I can remember, I mean, he never realised at the time, but I did, that this was going to be our last ever lesson.
Oh, yeah.
When I came up to Hallamshire. And that what I expected at the end of the lesson, that he would burst into tears. But there was just no emotion whatsoever. I remember shaking his head. Oh, thanks, Nick. I said, do you realise this is our last lesson? And he went, that we've ever had after about 25, 30 years or whatever it's been. And he went, oh, no, it's not. He was denying it. No, it's not. No, it's not. And it was. And that was the last lesson we'd ever had.
And what was that?
Start, not the end, though. Jethro asked you about the start, not the end.
Oh, the start. I thought, see, I'm going deaf in my old age. We started really working together heavily. What do you reckon, Nick, about when you were 18-ish?
World Juniors, the Princeton World Juniors was 98, kind of August 98, and I think it was a kind of season after that, so it was probably 99-ish.
Yeah, 99-ish.
But I had bits and bobs, but full-time was from 99.
And am I right in thinking
before that there was always connection through national squads where I'd always coach him. But what you might call being his personal coach was probably when he was about 19.
And I remember from our conversations, DP, and Nick, it'd be interesting to hear your side of the story, but you weren't too flattering of Nick's technique when he first came to you, right, DP? Is that fair to say?
That is, I mean, that's even, you're actually describing that very lightly. I have to say, considering he became such a great player, it was probably the worst technique I'd ever seen.
No, that's not true.
No, it is.
Coach Ben Garner's forehand one.
No. Yeah, but at least it had some class behind him. You used to wear your shorts up to your chest. Your swing it was pretty bad, really. But the one thing he always had was really good attitude, and he always tried the best that he could. And he was a good volleyer. So he had all those assets. But really, being serious for a sec, his technique really needed sorting out if it was going to give him a chance to become a world-class player. He will have always been good. Yeah. Maybe 16 in the world, but I don't think he would have got any further than that if his technique wasn't dealt with, in my opinion.
So Nick, I mean, I'd love to hear what your side of that story is, and how did that feel coming in as, top junior and, one of the best juniors in the world, I guess, for your age group at that point, but being told that your technique needed kind of...
Yeah, it was a funny one because you were kind of doing all right. It's not like you were, a junior who was 20 in England or, low down. I'd got to the semis of the World Juniors, been number one in England in the juniors. So you were kind of doing all right and starting to make a few strides against the pros. And as DP said, kind of your fitness, your resilience, your attitude or what have you, fighting spirit kind of were good. But I think it was kind of almost foreseeing the future and thinking, well, that might get you to a certain point. And then if you only address some faults at that point, then that's going to be a harder struggle. So it's kind of the sooner the better. Yeah. It's funny now because I've got the boot on the other foot and trying to coach some players myself. And the key thing was that it has to be led by the player in a way, and then DP could then go to work. So I remember him saying, well, what about this? Do you think this? And I was going, oh, yeah. And then it wasn't until one day I remember ringing him up, probably like 6 months after he'd maybe introduced it, and saying, right, I see what you mean now. I want to go for it. And when you kind of get that full buy-in, that's almost as a coach, you can kind of go, right, I can start now. I can go to work.
Yeah, it was very much what Nick was very good at after that 6 months. And really before that is like once he bought into what I was trying to explain, he literally bought into it. He listened to every single thing I said. There was never much doubt. It was like he was just going to listen and do it, which which is interesting that not many players will do that. It was 110% commitment from him. So
and some of the stuff. Well, he had a decent track record of,
Yeah, you coached some players before,
the Cassies of the world that I'd kind of seen and admired and looked up to, and it's not like you had someone who you didn't necessarily, the trust was 100%. So,
and that was one of the most important things, because when you've got someone like that, you're going on a journey together, and you're just telling the truth, really. It's like in life, if you tell the truth, some people like it, if you're dead straight, and some people don't. So with Nick, all the time, you could be dead straight with him. He might have a sulk every now and then. He was known for sulking in those days a little bit, but you could be dead straight with him and he'd take it, which was a nice thing for a coach to have.
And so was that immediate, or did that take 6 months to kind of build up?
I would think after the first little initial period, I was trying to break it in slowly, if you like. And then eventually it just got to the stage, well, come on, cut through that crap now. It's like, in a way, it was like you're dealing with a baby. Do as you're told and get on with it and do it. And unfortunately for Nick, I'm only joking there, he just listened to every word I really said, which probably out of most people you coach, he was the one that did that with Laura and Jenny and a few of those players.
Well, can you give us a little bit of insight just to frame it then? What were those kind of really significant technical changes that were being worked on immediately? Like, was it swing fundamentals? Was it grip, or was it?
There was always the grip issue, which is one of my sort of DP is always on about the grip. But mainly, it was really trying to get him to open up his swing, because he was very tight in his swing. His elbow was very tucked into his hips and everything. So we just wanted to broaden the swing out to give it a lot more spacing and get that extension, which I talk about going through. And really, a lot of it was, and the follow through, and the gist of really was that. And then we got more into what the grip can do, etc., etc.
So is it fair to say that work then allowed you to go on, Nick, to become the volleyer that you became later on in your career? Was that early work unleashing the space in the swing?
I think it was obviously massive. As soon as DP said that about the space, that was the first thing that came up in my mind, was obviously how that fitted with being a volleyer.
Yeah.
But as DP said, I kind of had that almost mindset from a young age. I loved to kind of hunt the volley. I don't know what that was from. I kind of played a bit of badminton at school. I don't know. Mark Hornby, who's my first coach, he laid a great foundation for me in terms of the physical fitness, knowing how to play tactically quite smartly with a lob and looking for the volley, really. And that was kind of the fundamentals. And so I always say to people now, you can talk about the technique of volleying as much as you want, but you have to have the mindset. You have to be hunting the ball. You have to look for it early and see it early. Otherwise, preparation's almost too late. Even if the preparation's great, the preparation has to start from the eyes and the brain first, and even the feet second and the racket third. So I kind of maybe had the first one of those, and then the things that DP helped me with were the second and third, and then that kind of went into a nice.
Awesome. I think when it comes to natural volleyers, I think, it's all well and good saying, he had good foundations and everything, but that's not giving him the credit. I think a lot of people who volley very well, and I noticed that with Peter Nicol when he was a young boy, the first thing I noticed when I went on court is that he volleyed the ball. Like, I thought, where's that come from? And it wasn't because he was taught to do it. He just had this natural instinct for it. And I think Nick was a bit like that. It was a natural instinct to volley, obviously encouraged as well. But I think it's just a natural hunger that a good volleyer has.
So do you think that's a natural hunger to step forward, or is that just an ability to see the ball a bit earlier, step into a line earlier and read your opponent earlier?
I think it's seeing it. I think it's seeing it early. I think and then they'll step forwards. They go through this 3-stage, I'd say. They'll look at a ball, and it happens very quickly, obviously. They look, can I volley? No, I can't. Can I take the ball behind the service box? No, I can't. Now I'm going to take it off the back wall. Or they go, can I volley? Yes, boom. Can I volley? Can I take the ball behind the service box? Yes, boom. So they never just let the ball go to the back of the court for basic rallying reasons. It was always that hungry instinct,
Yeah, well, that became very apparent always watching you play, Nick. You were always, trying to not let the ball hit the back wall, right? If you could.
Well, I was definitely related it to the physical side. I remember even in the juniors, probably it might have been his chicken egg. It might have been because technically you weren't great. It might have been that, your mindset was just your style of play. But I always wanted to get the pace up. I remember when I was at a junior tournament, my dad always said, the pace has got a bit slow. Can't you be giving them too much time to play? So it was kind of, my style was I was always physically fit. I'd kind of trained quite well as a kid and wanted to play a fast pace, wanted to get the pace high. And a lot of that is, it's not you don't get the pace high by hitting the ball harder. You get the pace high by taking the ball earlier. And the earliest you can take it is on the volley. So that physical side always went hand in hand. From a young age, I wanted to make the game quite hard for my opponent because I knew even from a young age, I was never going to win if it became a battle of skill. So, and that kind of went full circle to when you were playing the likes of Ramy, really. Even though your skill levels had improved dramatically to top world level, you always had that challenge playing someone who was better than you in those elements, even when you got to top of the game.
For sure. Well, talk to me about the evolution of that and that skill development, because, when Nick came to you as an 18, 19-year-old, obviously there's this desire to get on the volley and desire to up the pace, but there's, you became probably the best forehand volley, or had the best forehand volley drop in the whole world, right?
Yes.
So was that something that didn't come natural and required lots of work? And, how did that skill development to work the racket face, to leave the ball short, to create that exceptional short game happen?
I don't know how that shot developed.
No, it basically came from, I was always very much into like extending the elbow, if you like. And I remember at the time, in those years, we spent a lot of time with Stafford Murray, who used to work for England Squash, who now lives in New Zealand. And we're doing a lot of video work with Nick. And I think because I had this thing about this extension, I think everything just started to fall in place and everything started backing it all up because he could see himself on the video, because he's very good technically with the video and the analysis, Stafford. And it just sort of, I think it just developed through that. And also with Nick, which I don't know if he agrees with, he's a little bit, well, they call him Gadget Man, don't they? Because I wouldn't say he's totally double jointed, but he had this extra reach that people, normal players, didn't particularly have. So if you remember Nick in his heyday, that forehand volley, he'd just step across and, put that extension out. And he always had that extra reach than the 99% of squash players. So it all fell into place pretty quickly after the initial, hardship of it all. And he'd come out and volley a lot. And I always remember with Nick in the early years, he'd play Linku, for instance, and he'd come out like a bullet, like a greyhound out the gates. And he'd go 1-love up and 7-3 up. And you're thinking, gosh, he's going to get Linku. I think it was not quite world number one then, but was a very good player. And then all of a sudden, everything would just collapse because he couldn't keep the pace going. So he was coming out too fast out the traps, and then he'd get caught. But eventually, he learned how to deal with the speed that he had in the volleying in the right mix. And he was able to play the same speed at the beginning as he could at the end. And that's when Nick really came through. He got that.
What age was that, Nick, again? Remind me when you kind of like...
I was probably, because I don't know, like it's become quite synonymous about kind of having that later longevity about not getting to world number one until I was pretty much 30. But I actually got to 5 in the world when I was 23, 24.
Yeah.
And then I had a few years kind of between kind of 5 and 10. And
shoulder
then
injury as well.
Shoulder surgery. And then I kind of came back and reinvented a few things. But I had probably, about 3 or 4 years in the top 8 before when I was a contender, and I actually won a British Open in that time. Yeah, and it was a bit out of the blue, but there was no consistency really.
Well, Nick was very good at winning a tournament, coming back, getting a little bit up himself, and then he'd fly off to the tournament the next week, thinking he's going to be the slayer, and he'd lose in the first round.
That was something that was synonymous throughout my career.
Yeah.
Whether it was that background of always being the kind of the hunter and the mentality was always the chaser. Whenever I kind of felt like, I've cracked something, get slightly overconfident, then that was always when I was at my most vulnerable. It could be in the middle of a match when you're 7-3 up. That was DP always used to say to me, flipping Nick, lost the lead again. You dropped or 2-love up, dropped the third game, or when you just won a tournament and then the next tournament, I was really vulnerable the first or second round of the next tournament. Whatever reason that was probably my biggest Achilles heel right the way through my career, really.
Yeah, but you got it into good order later on.
Yeah, but I'd still drop silly games, 2-0 up and something.
Well, it was every time you tried to be clever.
You tried to be clever, it just didn't suit me.
You didn't suit it to be clever.
So you've gone to Coventry, didn't you?
Yeah.
So when you talked about reinventing yourself in the latter part of your career, obviously the shoulder injury was a significant amount of time out, but what did that reinvention kind of entail, and then how did you two work together to... Well,
I mean, if Nick doesn't mind me butting in, I remember when he had his shoulder injury and he couldn't play for 8 or 9 months, I think. I remember going to Holland with him to play. There was a tournament in Amsterdam.
That was my first one back.
It was his first tournament back, and he went there and he won it. He beat John White in the final. And I can remember when you beat John White, I remember saying to myself, Nick Matthew is going to be world number one. Mm-hmm. That was the first time in my heart that I thought I really, really believed that he would be world number one. And it was after 8 months off, and he won that tournament, and I thought, he's going to be world number one. And I just knew he would be, which transpired.
So what changed in your mind then, Nick, in that period?
Basically, you didn't see DP for about 6 months.
See, he's always been nice to me.
That was the first thing. So it freshened me up. So when I did see him again, I was like, okay, I'm ready now.
He's ready now.
Take this on.
Recharge. No, I definitely think that, you can get on the treadmill of just playing, training, and these improvements that you're trying to make. I mean, we were kind of lucky that we stumbled across those big improvements that we were talking technically right at the start of my career. So I was kind of 19, and even then was a challenge to improve because you saw other people maybe shoot past you that were rankings wise that were kind of below you before, but it was easier because you're always, if you start at 300 in the world, even if you're not improving as quickly as some others, you're still going in the right direction ranking wise. If you start changing things at 20 in the world, then I don't know. So I think the first thing was I just got off that treadmill and I was able to just take a bit of a pause and reset and just ask myself the question, or my psychologist kind of asked a lot of things to me. Why you've been between 5 and 8 for the last 3-4 years? You know, you obviously got great, you're doing things well, but why have you not? And I just asked those questions. Why have you not got to the top 4? And changed a couple of things. Probably psychologically was the biggest thing. Physically, I trained like a maniac because I couldn't go on court for like 5-6 months. But I think psychologically, I learned so much in that period. And it really reignited my hunger to realize I wasn't going to do it forever, and I needed to rest, and I needed to just gave me a better balance to everything really. And then when I did come back on court, I felt different. I think, you know, you see pictures before and after, and physically I changed shape in that period as well. Like
you got leaner, hadn't you?
Yeah.
Not that you were ever, but one time you not that you've ever been really muscly, but maybe your calves, and you lean, you got yourself right down. You know,
just kind of maximised the period off really. And I've said that I've used the analogy now with some of the players that I work with, where I kind of didn't think about squash. I knew it was helpful that I knew kind of the end point. So I knew it was going to be a long 8-9 month slog. So I could place. The problem right now is players are, well, when are we going to be on? You know, should I take a rest now? Should I not? The uncertainty is the problem. And what I was looking at, I just kind of took 2 months pretty much without even looking at squash. I didn't follow the tournaments, didn't watch, you know, there wasn't Squash TV in those days, but I didn't follow it in the same way. I just had a total break, went to the gym every day, did my thing, and then I came back to squash kind of refreshed, and looked at other areas where I could improve, like diet, like physical, like the mental, and so on.
Yeah. And do you think that break stood you instead for the longevity of your career, or was that inevitable? Would you think just, you know, having that time out then almost halfway through your career?
Even when I hit now, I'm obsessed. I have to do all the TheraBand stuff. Yeah. Even if I'm just coaching, it's funny. I don't know whether it's psychological, but if I'm just feeding the ball for an hour, I feel my shoulder the next day, and that might be just in my head. But if I'm feeding the ball, I still have to do my exercises. So it's been ingrained in my life ever since, really. And probably more than anything, and shoulder exercises are almost a symbol of preparation. And I feel
he'd come for a lesson. Supposed to be starting at 10:30, 11:15. He's done 500 armbands, and I'm like sitting there with my racket between my legs thinking, how flipping boring is this? And he would have to do it every single time he came for a lesson.
And it got worse because the shoulder was one thing, and then when I had later problems with my ankles, so I had to do all my ankle exercises. Then I had knee issues, so I had to do all my knee. And then, so I couldn't just turn up and get straight on the court to warm up everything. So my warm-ups in the end were longer than the actual sessions.
It actually became a dance eventually, with every little thing that was slightly going wrong.
You knew it was taking too long when DP stepped on the court and started doing solo.
So tell me about the actual, you know, the coaching that was involved. Firstly, let's start with the on-court sessions, and then talk about kind of weekly structure and how you were communicating. But, you know, how much of that work was technical? How much was it targets? How many times a week was it? You know, what was your typical setup?
Well, in the early days, I mean, when we really trying to get his swing better, we were probably, gosh, I would say it could be sometimes, what, Nick, 3 times a week?
Well, I lived up there for a couple of
years. We lived in the squash house, so we were able to get to each other a lot. And it was like that for, I would imagine, about 5 years or 4, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. And then what started to happen, our next bit of our relationship was more, if Nick was off playing 3 tournaments, what used to happen, certain things always used to creep back in. Little things that you might call that weren't, you know, like a hook like the wrist would hook a bit at the top of the swing on the forehand. And my job really became to make sure that I'd noticed the things that were creeping back in that weren't that good and put them right again. So later on in the career, it was very much about that, not trying to get him to do new stuff particularly.
But all very technically, still very technically focused.
It was still very technically, Nick had come across, and that's why I used to take the mickey out of him warming up, because I just say to him, all I'm going to do is stand behind the service box, and you're going to hit forehand drives or volleys or, drops, and then I'd switch to the backhand. And it was like, well, why are you warming up? We're not going to be doing, me running you around the court like a lunatic. And so we were always working on those fine technical points. And I think credit to Nick. Everyone always thinks Nick was what I wouldn't say not. He didn't play like maybe Shabana did, who could roll nicks and things like that. But it was the same with Peter Nicol as well. People like Peter Nicol and Nick Matthew, in their own way, are more skillful than when you see the obvious skill like Ramy can do or Shabana did. They were actually tremendously skillful, but to the average guy who didn't quite know the nuances, they couldn't see it. So the little half inches when you play a shot, unless you were an aficionado, you could spot it and you can see it working, which is very skillful, but the average guy couldn't. So I would say Nick Matthews' progression through the coaching was what I would call subtle skills, not obvious skills. It was obvious that he volleyed. That was very obvious to everybody. So, Jethro, you saw him play. You knew he was a great volleyer. That was an obvious thing. You knew he was obviously a very good mover, very efficient. Those were the obvious bits, but the skill of the racket wasn't as obvious.
Yeah, that's really
that makes sense.
No, it does. And then what about tactically then? So, presumably you're either there with Nick at events or you're watching Squash TV back. Were you dissecting the tactics of matches and thinking about playing opponents?
Against certain opponents, you would. I mean, so someone like, I'm going to get into trouble now. I always remember
it's
Nick.
Not like you, DP.
I always remember Nick playing Miguel. Is it Miguel Rodriguez in the Tour Champions? And I think, did you drop the first game or something, Nick?
Not sure which one you
probably can't remember. In between games, I remember saying to you, "What are you doing?" I said, "Why aren't you playing lob?" I don't know if you can remember. I said, "There's one reason why you play a lob against Miguel Rodriguez without stating it on here. It's pretty obvious. Get the ball high. He can't get himself up there for obvious reasons." So things like that would happen. And we had a very good tactical plan against Ramy when you could make it work. And I know it's been documented many times, but that time Nick beat him 3-love in the British Open, we really had a tactical plan for that match, which worked. Nick was able to execute that plan perfectly. And he actually, the only time I would ever say, Nick, you made Ramy look ordinary. And at the end of the match, remember he ran off and went sulking and didn't come back with his prize giving. So those tactics were always being brought in if you could, you were good enough to be able to do those tactics.
I think we were lucky as well in the early days. Obviously, DP was national coach as well, so it meant that he was present at
every tournament, really.
The tournaments, and even in those days, Stafford. You mentioned Stafford before, and some of the work with Stafford had two areas that really helped us both on, and one was the technique. When you'd be working on specifics that you couldn't see with the naked eye, and doing the video stuff was so amazing. But then the second side was being at tournaments and looking at opponents and looking at patterns of play and where they hit the winners and errors, and you'd structure the court and you'd start to see little areas that maybe you could exploit and areas that you needed to be aware of and careful about, and things like that helped, didn't they? And then you'd obviously have to put that into your own shape. But
yeah, so at that time, Jethro, I was at every tournament, which it was accessible because I was national coach. And so you would see Nick and others, obviously, but play literally every big tournament. So we were very blessed to be able to do that, which all coaches can't do today.
Makes a big difference. I think, now we've got Squash TV, so you can be there, but being there and just feeling it and seeing it, you see it in a different way, for sure. And but just going back to the previous point there, you said about the technique. I mean, pretty much 95% of DP sessions were technique. And your way of giving a hard session was a shot and a ghost, isn't it, really?
Well, he did at one time, Jethro. I remember towards the end of his career, I always used to do this thing where you had to work for 25 minutes without a rest. So basically, you might have to do 400 drives for 2 minutes. then a 45-second ghost,
Must
straight
have been
into
hard
the
for you,
backhand
DP,
drive.
at that point, huh?
Say that again.
25 minutes non-stop feeding for you must have been quite
Must have
challenging.
been quite hard, actually. And Nick thought, oh, yeah, I'll be able to do this. And I always remember the first time he did it, he came over and said, we're going to do this in the later part of his career, because he was younger. And after 50 minutes, because he thought he was going to breeze through it, and after 15 minutes, I could see him looking at me thinking, this is a bit harder than I thought it was. And then after 20 minutes, he was like, this is a lot harder than I thought it was. And after 25 minutes, he was lying on the floor like a baby. crying for his mom. So, it wasn't just me. I could have done some other stuff. But as I got older, I was a bit more rigid in my physicality.
But presumably you were talking about tactics then a lot. And I'm interested to know, Nick, or to discuss, did you have a game plan for every single match you went on? Were you trying to think, what does my opponent do well here? Or were you thinking, I'm just going to impose my game on my opponent? Or was it
the first thing to say there is to think that, everyone, you can have, DP said the word execution, and you can have the best game plan in the world. You can do all the analysis and all of everything and have the plan. But I think technique allows you to execute plan. Of course, there's more to it than that, because your opponent's trying to do something else, and there's so many variables. But if you haven't got the technique to apply a plan of tactics, then it's kind of right. You need to go backwards a step and work on the technique, and that was kind of always the first port of call. And if your technique, like DP mentioned, in between tournaments, you'd get a few bad habits. It was kind of going for a little MOT. Every time I'd come back from a tournament or a run of tournaments, I'd go, and the first session would always be a quick MOT. Let's just check these different parameters that we had. Is the spacing good? Check the grip, check the follow through, things like that. And then when they looked like they were working, then you could start to progress and then say, right, okay, last time you played Ramy, this happened, or last time again, you weren't volleying enough, this. But unless you actually had the technique in full working order in the beginning, the tactics was almost a waste of time, because you were getting ahead of yourself.
I remember, not naming names because it's not appropriate, but I remember when in Virginia, when they used to have that tournament on, I always remember sitting with the coach and he was all about tactics, and he's very, very good at tactics. And I said to him, to me, technique dictates the tactic, because if you haven't got the technique, you can't put the tactic into place. So you might be talking the right game, but your technique lets you down. And he couldn't quite never understand that. So to me, if you're a good tactician on a squash court, it's because your technique's relatively proficient. So to me, technique comes first, tactics comes second, which might sound a bit simple. But if your technique's very good, it's easier to access the tactics. Let's put it like that.
You can play how you want to play then, essentially.
Yeah.
Then you could start then taking it, you mentioned Jethro, take it to the next level where you start to then formulate game plans around your strengths, and you obviously get to a point, hopefully, where you do think about your opponent, but you really try to impose yourself because you believe that you can be better than them if you get that right. But that only comes much later, once all of those many, many years of building that up. I couldn't do that at 23. When I was 23, it was very much a case of, okay, I know what I'm trying to do, but, whereas later on, it was a case of, I know what I'm trying to do, but just be careful about this. It was a slight change.
For sure. And I very much fall into the same camp as you guys from a coaching philosophy. For me, that technique's got to hold up. Well, you've got to have a solid technique.
Whatever that technique is, Jethro, it doesn't mean to say my style's the best, or Robert Owen, he teaches in a certain way, or it's basically whatever style works technically, fine. It doesn't have to be a certain style.
No, well, for sure. You look at the top 10 in the world now in the men's and women's game, they all hit the ball differently. There's no one way to play squash, but it's what a technique has to do is give you consistency to put the ball into the areas you want to.
And hold up under pressure. Like
that's
Peter,
my next point.
Always used to say, Peter Nicol was, for him, we all know what Peter was like. His technique under pressure was absolutely superb, especially with the lob. That used to win him so many matches when he was actually under pressure.
It's funny that the pair of us, coached by you, had good lobs, and I don't think we ever did a single session where we practiced the lob, did we?
No, we never did. Yeah, but I think, to be fair, if I look at it, with being totally honest, Mark Hornby helped you get a good lob.
He did, yeah.
Neil Harvey, who obviously coached Peter a lot, had a fantastic lob. So your lob and Peter's lob was really taught to you by somebody else, I would say.
So Nick, you touched upon the battles you had with Ramy over the years, and I'm sure everybody at home would be fascinated to hear about the journey that you both went on to combat Ramy, and what was it like when he kind of exploded onto the scene through the amazing battles that you did have, and how did you adjust and adapt, and how did you work with DP to kind of combat that?
It was funny because I think to start with, he kind of exploded past me. I was probably top 10 and he just came out of the blue from nowhere, and just suddenly everyone else was gradually coming like that, the young ones, and he just kind of went boom and suddenly was above you, and you felt like, whoa, he's suddenly beating the Palmers and all these kind of guys and who were ranked above you. And I felt like the first few times I played him, it was kind of just a bit of a whirlwind, and that you were relying purely on those fighting qualities that you mentioned earlier, where you're digging in and trying to make life difficult for him in those kind of ways. And then it wasn't until maybe later that you had more of a control over your own skill set that you could start to, counterbalance in a different way. And yeah, it wasn't just Ramy, but I think he was probably the one. There was a really good period there where between maybe 2009 and through to 2013-ish, where, and there was James and Greg in the mix and Shabana as well, but we were 1 and 2 for a good chunk of that time, and we had a lot of finals and a real clash of styles, and he, probably more than any other player I've played against in my career, made you go away and try to reinvent yourself and reinvent tactics. And DP had probably a similar thing with Jansha, with Peter Nicol, where they made you look at things in a different way, and you trained just for one opponent. And we went through a phase where we probably just trained for Ramy,
I mean, one of the things that used to come out was, I always used to say to Nick when he played Ramy, and it was nothing to do with the hitting of the ball or the tactics. It was like, don't engage with him, because Ramy was very clever, had a great sense of humor, and was very fun-loving in his way when he was on court, And I always used to say to Nick, as soon as you get involved with him, and I don't mean this in the nicest, I mean in the nicest way, Nick, he was too quick-witted for Nick. Not that Nick's not quick-witted, he's got a great sense of humor sometimes. But I used to say to him, do not engage with him, because he's so quick-witted, and it's not just with Nick, it was with everybody. He would outfox you that way, and he'd make him look the good guy, and you'd look like the bad guy. He's very clever like that.
Well, his biggest danger probably was himself, Ramy. He'd get in his own head, and he'd be fighting those kind of demons or whatever he called them at one point, didn't he? And when you did engage, and the thing is, he got you to such a heightened sense of adrenaline that if you tried to play in that nice calm way, you'd get hammered 3-love. So you had to play almost on a tightrope with Ramy, that you had to be full sense of alert from rally number 1. And that meant that to be there and to be moving sharp and thinking sharp and playing sharp and hitting everything with purpose, you kind of were on a little bit of a temperamental kind of tightrope as well, because you knew you had to play with aggression, otherwise you're going to get hammered. But then that meant that sometimes you could then boil over, because it was just basically just putting you under a lot of stress. And I think when you then got frustrated, say with him or the ref, or you gave him an excuse to stop thinking about himself, and he'd look at you and go, right, I'm just going to beat you now.
Right.
Whereas actually when you kind of did all that yourself, but kept him a bit kind of calmer, he got more in his own head.
Right.
And there was a very different dynamic with Greg on that. There was a very different dynamic with James.
Shabaggy was another one. You didn't really ever want to engage with Shabaggy.
You wanted to go toe-to-toe with him to a point, to let him know you were there. Otherwise, he would try to bully you on the court. But then at the same time, you didn't want to go too far, because then you'd basically get bullied. So there was all these little psychological dynamics at play, and finding your own balance. I always used to play my best. Around that time, Wayne Rooney was probably the best football player. My psychologist always used to say, well, look at someone like Rooney. If he didn't play with that edge, he's in danger maybe of getting sent off from time to time. But if he didn't play with that little bit of fire in his belly, he won't be the same player. the reason.
I think the other thing, though, Nick, fire in your belly was part of your natural personality.
Yeah. If I took that away, I tried to take that away from time to time, and I just was not.
I've had other coaches come to me over the years, especially with Nick, even with Laura, and they'd go, he needs to curb his behaviour when he's on court, not nattering at the referee and things like that. And I said to him, well, and he said, oh, do you agree with that as his coach? I said, well, it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. It was a matter, if I tried to take that away from Nick to get him to, that's not his natural personality. It would have actually, like you just said there, Nick, when you did try to do that every now and then, you never really played your best, did you?
And I got better, and I definitely, if I watch any videos now myself from 23 through to 28, I kind of go, I'll just shut up and get on with the game. It's way too much. But then later on, I kind of was a lot better.
A lot better. No, you definitely were. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that you couldn't take that part of you away from you.
Yeah, well, it was a fine line. I was better with it than without it, for sure. Even though sometimes I then, because it is a tightrope, and any tightropes when under emotional stress are gonna kind of fall one way or the other, I guess.
Well, this ties into a fan question. Well, a question that actually Laura Massaro suggested asking Nick at this point, and it really is about psychology. And she said, "You're known for being really tough. So, what role did psychology play in becoming tough, or the work you did with the psychologist? Or was it innately in you, or was there specific work you did with a psychologist at the time?"
I think it's very much like technical coaching. He said there, I had that fight and that willpower and that will to succeed in me and wanting to do it, but very much like the technical coaching that I went through with DP that enabled me to carry out some tactics. With the psychology, I think that he just taught you those little almost technical psychology pieces that enabled you to then put it into practice on the court. I feel like the raw ingredients were there, but it was just, again, those subtleties that, and you learn a lot of that through playing. You learn getting tougher through getting physically a bit stronger as well, but they're the kind of raw ingredients. But then he kind of just helped those subtleties. And we used to refer to a rev counter a lot, just right. Where you're never going to, a car, when it's driving at its best, is never just going to stay in one point of the counter throughout the whole of the drive. Throughout a match, you have to have different gears where you go down a gear and then up a gear, and you try not to go in the red zone, but to go at your fastest, you have to be somewhere in that. You can't be way down here. And we spoke a lot about how to get into those areas of a match and have different gears so you could come in and out. You weren't just right on the red line the whole match, because then you're going to tire yourself out, and so on and so forth. And I think, a lot of the subtleties really from the psychology, less than, I feel like that will to win is sometimes in you or it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, just tying that back into Ramy then, would you say that when you got on top of Ramy, was that down to having the psychological edge, or was there other parts of the game that you had to get on top of him or dictate? Was it about getting a higher tee position than him, or volleying more than him, or psychological more than anything?
I think there's two players in my career that I played more than 20 or so, more than 10 times where I had a negative head-to-head, and Ramy was one and Shabagi was the other. And obviously, Mohammed came up so young. So I think in the beginning I had a positive head-to-head, and then he took over towards the end. And Ramy, obviously, we were playing both in that period of the peak, basically, years. He was the only player who had a negative head-to-head. So I hesitate to kind of say I ever got the psychological advantage on him, because the head-to-head proved otherwise.
But in individual matches, when those ones that you did win,
when I did do well, it's when I'd played him a couple of times recently.
Right.
I always remember with Ramy struggling the most when I'd not played him for a little while. So let's say that one after the British Open was in May, the one that won 3-Love, 2012, I think May, June, and then I didn't play him again until maybe September that year, because we had the summer break. And I think I lost, it was in Manchester, British Grand Prix, I think I lost 3-Love or 3-1, and just felt, wow, the pace, I've done the summer training, I feel super fit, I'm confident in my game, but all of a sudden the pace at what you played surprised you again, even though you knew it was coming. And then that frazzled your decision making as a result.
Yep.
So it was always then the next time I'm like, all right, okay, I play in the next tournament. It's fresh in my mind what I need to do. I did a little bit better. And then maybe the next time I managed to get a win in.
Right.
That was kind of how it always worked. When I not played him for ages, it just used to feel horrible.
Well, I remember you saying to me once, Nick, you said he's the only player I've played after 5 rallies. It's like somebody's punched me in the guts.
Yeah, I remember doing a full summer's training, and you know what it's like. You come off the summer training, you're probably at your physical fittest. Maybe match fitness takes a tournament or two to get the very best, but physically I felt so good. I'd beaten maybe Greg in the semis, and then I played 5 games of the final, and felt like my heart rate was about 210. So he just did something different to you physically
than others.
Yeah, no, I mean the pace that you guys, I think you took it to a new level, didn't you? That was another transition point in the evolution of the game when you two started really upping the pace and trying to hurt each other. You know, it was like the game changed. You look at the game now and it's obviously ridiculously fast, but I think you two were the catalysts for that, weren't you?
Some of those Mohammed and Ramy games were pretty good. It was a shame they didn't have a few more.
Yeah, and I always remember when Nick was a kid at national squads, you know, Peter Nicol played a hell of a pace. I know it's very hard to see on video these days, but, you know, Peter Nicol in terms of volleying and taking the ball early was something that Nick maybe not realised at the time, but he used to every now and then was allowed to go on and play him as long as he tried 100%, so he wasn't a naughty boy. He'd be playing Peter Nicol when he was 16, who played, you know, was world number 1. And, you know, for Nick, that would have said to him, well, if you want to be world number 1, this is getting around the type of pace you have to play at. So if you're exposed to that when you're 16 and getting hammered, you start to realise, if I want, you know, what Peter Nicol was, I've got to be able to play at least at this pace.
So, yeah, in playing Pete in those junior squads at that young age, was it always a desire of yours to be a professional squash player from that very young age? Or was there a natural point kind of later on in your junior career? Or was it at 18, 19 that you decided this is what I actually want more than anything?
It's a long time ago now, trying to think back.
Well, you remember, you used to sit on a chair outside the court, and I used to say to you, you're allowed to go on with him for 20 minutes at the end of the session, because you're only, I said, but don't waste his time when you got to get on there and you get hammered. Love, love, and love. Can't you remember?
Which Peter? I missed the question before.
Peter Nicol.
Oh, Nicol. Oh, when Peter came to the English setup, you know, I'd already decided I wanted to be it by then, be a professional player, etc. But I kind of noticed something different. His professionalism, his preparation, he just went to that nth degree, did 5% more than everyone else. And that doesn't mean he spent 5% more time on court. He knew when he was done. He knew there was a purpose to everything. His stretching, his warm-ups, what he ate, what he looked after himself. And there was some very good players on the England squad, don't get me wrong, in those days. You know, there was an era of players, wasn't there? Your Parkers, your Marsh, Nick Taylors, Mark Challoner, PJ, so on, Dell. But the Chris Walker, it's an unbelievable era. But Peter, there was something else from him that I learned, and he was a massive, massive influence on me.
Well, let's look to the future now and talk about your role as a coach, Nick. So I'm interested to find out how you're finding that transition, and then, you know, how much of DP's influence rolls over into your coaching now. Are you coaching in a similar way to the way that DP coached you, or are you taking bits of it? You know, well, what's your approach to coaching now?
Yeah, I mean, he's DP. You know, he's certainly the biggest influence in my coaching, no doubt. You know, I always ring him up and pick his brain about players that kind of working with. There's a few kind of nice crossovers. I think we've got some players who DP coaches who you might send down to Sheffield kind of once every few weeks just to get a different kind of session. And likewise, some players that I work with who I'll send up to DP to make sure their technical side of things is still getting that kind of input from the master on that side. So he's really kind of the guru for me in that sense. And I guess I'm just trying to shape it then with my own slight on it. I think if I did 100% of what DP did, then I would be trying to be DP, but he's certainly the biggest influence. And then trying to put my own, I guess, slant in with a little bit of the psychology that I've learned and, you know, that preparation and that the whole thing really. I'm lucky that I've also, a big help in my career was someone like Neil Guyry, Mark Campbell as well on the physical side. So I'm lucky that I've got people like that, the MDP as well as a bit of a mentor who I can tap into, because, you know, just because you had a good playing career, it certainly doesn't mean that you make a good coach. And I'm very aware of that. And I'm conscious that someone asked me once, who coaches the coaches? And I thought that was a really good question. And I'm really conscious of staying open-minded. And, you know, there might be something that you take, you know, DP mentioned Rob Owen. You know, he obviously does something great with his players. Rodney Martin's working with Shabaggy now, and he's had some great players. Who else? Hadrian Stiff, obviously. There's some really good coaches out there. Obviously, all the coaches in Egypt. So I think, you know, whilst DP will be the biggest influence, I'd be foolish if I wasn't open-minded to looking at how the game evolves and develops, and putting my own slant on that as well. So try to get the balance, really.
Absolutely. And DP, I guess the similar question to you, just wondering how your coaching is evolving, or are you know, does your philosophy with the game continue to change?
I think with me now at my age now, without sounding I'm too old, I think I had so many years of working with a lot of top players. It gets to the stage where I really enjoy now coaching people, come from a lesson. There's a couple of girls I coach, a couple of boys, and I like going in and trying to help the best I can, but getting involved where it's really down to the nitty gritty, like say with Nick or Jenny or Laura Mazzaro or Cassie Jackman from years ago. I think the young player of today sort of they don't really get that style anymore. Everyone wants a quick fix, whereas my thing takes a little bit longer. And I think of the young players today aren't prepared to go through that. If I could really get down to without the nitty gritty, they're not prepared to go through what it really, really takes to become really, really good. And I think, you know, I'm 61 now, and I think young people, when they're coming through, you know, I can remember when I was young, you know, I'm sort of getting on a bit, you know, and I think that's just how life is. It's like a football manager, isn't it? You know, Mourinho isn't the coach he was when he was 30, is he? You know, because he's done it for so long now. But I still love coaching, and I really like helping people, and that's where I'm at in my sort of coaching thing now. More of helping people to try and get a little bit better. Nice. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does completely. This is going to be a good time to say thank you. That's been, you know, truly, truly fascinating and really, really enjoyable. And you know, it's fascinating to hear the stories. So thank you, DP. Thank you, Nick.
No, great. Enjoyed it.
Been fun. Thanks, Jethro.
I hope everyone out there sort of, you know, can glean something from it anyway.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in these strange times, guys at home, remember those four walls will still be there when all this is done. But for now, keep on keeping on. And thank you, guys. We'll see you again.
Thanks, Jethro.